Today we're going to be moving into the 1800s, which for many people is really a golden age of children's literature, and when it really began to be taken seriously and much more started to be published. And just to recap again what was happening before the 1800s, you had oral traditions of people passing stories by word of mouth. You had Puritan instruction, which were basically moral and religious training. And then in the 1740s, you had John Newbery, who started publishing books that were not just designed to instruct, but also designed to be fun for children to read. Before the 1800s, books written for children were rare and almost always meant to teach a lesson. Over the course of the 19th century, children's literature transformed into its own rich and imaginative art form. So you can see in 1812, the Grimm brothers published their fairy tales in German. In 1865, Lewis Carroll published Alice in Wonderland. And really in the 1800s is really the start of the golden age of illustrated books. But just to sort of give you an overview of what was happening in the 1800s, you can see it starts in around 1812 with the Grimm brothers, and then by 1894 you're producing books like The Jungle Book. In the early 1800s, it was very similar to the late 1700s. We still were producing books in the didactic tradition, often chapbooks that were sold by peddlers. They were tiny and inexpensive and often hand-colored. They were, nursery rhymes with strict moral lessons. One of the earliest English writers writing children's books was Maria Edgeworth. She was born in 1768 and she died in 1849. And she was one of the earliest writers to bring realism to children's literature. And she also played an important role in the development of the European novel. During the first decades of the 19th century, she was probably one of the most widely read novelists in Britain and Ireland. So she's one of the earliest English writers. Now, starting in the 1820s, the translations of the Grimm brothers' work were starting to come across. In 1823, Edgar Taylor translated the Grimm's fairy tales to a book titled German Popular Stories. There also was a Charles Perrault revival. So some of those earlier books, like Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, started to get more English translations and become popular in Britain. But there also was some critics' pushback. So obviously, some people still condemned fairy tales as frivolous and dangerous and were bad influences on children. So there still was that puritanical line going through society. But we'll go ahead. In earlier classes, we had discussed the Brothers Grimm, but just to remind you that they published their collection of oral tales, Children in Household Tales, in 1812. So again, the famous stories, they had, an iteration of Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, but it really became popular in England with that Taylor transition in 1923. And you can see there were several editions going forward, and each time the revised editions, they were becoming more and more children friendly. So you can tell, like in the first edition of the Grimm brothers, there was about 60 tales. By the final edition, there was over 200 tales in that edition. There was also Hans Christian Andersen, who we discussed in that previous class as well. He was really also one that started not just retelling stories that he had heard, but starting to write original stories. And in the 1800s, this is something that you start to see, is that people are writing original stories specifically for children. And this is something that really starts in the 1800s. And so you start having things like Edward Lear and the nonsense verse. So these were writings that were limericks and absurd wordplay. They didn't really have a moral or a lesson. It was just really sort of a fun thing to read. And this was really when children's literature could exist simply to amuse and not necessarily just to prove, not just to have a lesson or a moral. It could just really be fun. And this was really paved the way for things like Alice in Wonderland and things that, were purely silly. In 1865, Lewis Carroll published Alice in Wonderland. It was written for a real child, Alice Little, and that first edition had illustrations by John Tenniel. There was no lesson and no moral. It was just a fun book, adventure for its own sake. And as we sort of discussed in the last lesson, he was also sort of making fun of some of the children's literature that had come before. But this is really considered the symbolic start of the golden age of children's literature, is this Alice in Wonderland. From the 1860s onward, children's books flourished. This was fueled by rising literacy rates. So more and more children were going into education. The idea of free education for all was starting to take hold. Printing improved. It became easier to print things, and also it became cheaper to print things in color, which really led to having illustrated children's books. And then there also was the new cultural belief that childhood deserved its own imaginative world. So that also meant having their own literature. And then this is also when there just started to be a publishing boom, with several magazines and imprints starting to be published. Serialized magazines became a major venue for children's fiction, letting readers follow stories, poems, and puzzles month after month. For example, the story The Little Princess was actually published in the St. Nicholas magazine, originally titled Sarah Crew, or What Happened at Miss Minchin's. So you can see that this was a really popular way for people to get literature during the 1800s. Picture books became more artistic in their own right, and there was a trio of illustrators whose names are still honored with Children's Book Awards today. There was Randolph Cathcart, who actually we will be discussing next week, Kate Greenway, and then also Walter Crane. So today we're mostly going to be talking about Kate Greenway and Walter Crane, because like I said, next week we'll be talking more about Randolph Cathcart. Catherine, or Kate Greenway, was an English Victorian artist and writer known for her children's book illustrations. She is now the namesake of a Children's Book Author Award in the UK. She wrote and illustrated over 150 books. So she did not just illustrate her own books, but she also illustrated other people's children's books. She began her career drawing for greeting cards, which were becoming more and more popular in the late 1800s. One of her most famous books is probably her first, which was published in 1879, Under the Window. And she's very much associated with the sort of Art Nouveau movement, and is quite famous for her illustrations. Walter Crane was an English artist and book illustrator. He's considered to be one of the most influential children's book creators of his generation. Crane's work featured some of the more colorful and detailed beginnings of the child in the garden motif that would characterize nursery rhymes and children's stories for decades to come. He was part of the arts and craft movement, and he didn't just produce illustrations for books. He did paintings, ceramic tiles, wallpapers, stained glass. He was a multimedia artist. He wrote and illustrated over 100 fiction and nonfiction titles, making him one of the most prolific creators of the arts and crafts movement. His output primarily consists of toy books for children, illustrated editions of classic stories, and his own written works on art, theory, and poetry. As mentioned, the advancing technology of printing during this time is what also helped lead the way for all of this children's literature that was being published. There were several advancements that had been made. For example, chromolithography, which is a multi-stone color printing that was able to make very vivid illustrations at an affordable price when done at scale. Edmund Evans, he was a printer whose color block technique sort of elevated the print book quality, and then also steam-powered presses. So mass production cut pieces could be made, and at those cheaper costs, it could be sent out not just to wealthy children, but to children from all classes. At this time, you started to have longer books being written for older children, and you had adventure stories for boys like Treasure Island, and really a sign of the time when this was being written, you had books that were geared towards boys that were more adventure stories, and then you had different kind of books being marketed towards girls. Stories for girls really were more known for their domestic realism. For example, Little Women. Those stories usually had realistic, flawed, relatable characters, and they influenced decades of family fiction. Also, at this time, boarding school tales became popular and a genre in their own right. They usually dramatized friendship and moral testing within institutional walls. For example, this Tom Brown's School Days set the template. It was written in 1857, and the stories balanced humor and character building, and they became very popular with both British and American readers. Andrew Lang's fairy books are a series of collections of true and fictional stories for children published between 1889 and 1913 by Andrew Lang and his wife Lenora Lang. The best known of the book series are the 12 collections of fairy tales known as the Colored Fairy Tales, or fairy books of many colors. So the Langs wrote it, and then Henry Justice Ford was the illustrator. The books assembled a large array of tales. The most famous is probably the first one, the Blue Fairy Book, and it had tales from many sources. So there were 7 tales from the Grimm brothers, 5 from Madame Aulnoy, 3 from the Arabian Nights, and there were also 4 Norwegian tales. So this was a bit like the Grimms and Charles Perrault. They were collecting books, but then they were adding these illustrations. And this was a very popular collection of stories. Also at this time, animals as storytellers and subjects became more popular in children's books. It helped explore morality and compassion that would resonate with young readers. So there's The Black Beauty in 1877. As I mentioned earlier, The Jungle Book, 1894. Also, there was an Aesop revival. So all those fables that we discussed began to become more popular at this time. And children's publishing started to really mature and become a serious business on its own. It wasn't just a side thing for publishers to be doing. They became something that was profitable, and producing, affordable books was a way to generate some income. So some of the most popular publishers were Routledge's Toy Books, Macmillan and Co. And then there also were these gift book editions, so lavishly bound holiday editions that you could give, and not necessarily for, everyday reading, but things that you could have to show off. The 1800s was really a time of shifting values for what was considered appropriate for children. Now, this really started probably in the 1700s with the Romantics and John Newbery, but it really became formalized and popular in the 1800s. So at the beginning of the 1800s, you still had this sort of didactic literature that everything had to have a moral, everything had to teach you a lesson. There had to be some sort of educational value for it to be geared towards children. But you can kind of see, by the time we get to the 19th century, you can just have books that are fun, or books that are just for entertainment, that children just want, like, to read for reading's sake is something that really started to take shape in the 1800s. And so you can really start to see that how we view children's books today start to be formalized in the 1800s. So you can see there's key themes of the century. So, there was more imagination over instruction. The ability, because of the advancements in printing technology, art and illustration was able to be better and be able to be mass marketed and mass printed to people. Also, there was a variety of genres. So, there was adventure books, domestic life books, there was fantasy books. There started to be more options. There wasn't just one story to be told. And also childhood as its own world. So children were seen as readers with their own tastes. It wasn't just that this is what adults wanted children to read. It started to shift to what do children actually want to read for themselves. Many of the genres that started in the 1800s are still around today, and they still influence what is happening today. So for example, the fantasy logic of Alice in Wonderland can still be seen in modern fantasy fiction. The fairy tales and the fables, we can see them in our animated movies today. We're still being drawn back to those stories. So you can see how things that happened in the 1800s still very much influence what we are doing today. Sorry that I had to cancel class, but we just have to sort of adjust the schedule. This was supposed to be the presentation for July 6th, but we'll have our guest lecturer July 6th. So you're watching this video instead of attending a class. In order to get a credit for attendance, you have to watch this video, and then in the discussion board where I have posted this video, read one of these poems, and these are all the Edward Lear, not all of them, but these are some of the Edward Lear nonsense verse. And I would like you in the discussion board below to answer these two questions. Because this was the session for July 6th, you have until the next class time, so let's say July 13th, to do this, and then I will mark you as present. So even if you would normally miss a class and have to write a summary, you don't need to do that this week. You can just do this bit of discussion with these poems. As always, if you have any questions about this lesson or anything else, feel free to email me. And just to reiterate, the next class will be July 6th at normal time, and we will be having a guest lecturer. So you can just attend class as normal on July 6th.